I'll say something today about the bearing of four ancient historians on the philosophy of history. First of all, Herodotus, secondly, Thucydides, thirdly, Polybius, and fourthly, Livy. Livy is a Roman historian whose life, more or less, shortish life, more or less spans the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. Polybius is a Greek historian, but writes almost entirely about ancient Rome, especially about the Punic Wars, the wars between Carthage and Rome. And Herodotus and Thucydides are Greek historians. Herodotus writes about the great Greek-Persian War, and Thucydides writes about the Peloponnesian War. So these people, to greater or lesser degree, are military historians, but their interest isn't confined to military history. And some of them write about politics, some of them write about culture. Livy intends his collected works to be a history of Rome from its foundation until the empire. Now, I'll say something about each of these four historians in turn, but I'll begin by saying something about the origins of history as a subject, history as something that's written in ancient Greece. Now, the Greeks, I think it's fair to say that the Greeks invent academic subjects, or the concept of an academic subject as we know it today. We owe this idea to the ancient Greeks. For example, Aristotle writes a book called The Physics, which he says is the attempt to solve problems about nature. He writes another book called Concerning the Generation of Animals, and more or less founds biology, not evolutionary theory, but he founds the idea of a taxonomy of animals, plants, life forms, generally. Aristotle, depending on the view you take, invents or discovers logic in Book Gamma of his book called Metaphysics. In Book Gamma, Aristotle identifies what he calls three laws of being: the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, and the law of identity, and says that these are inescapable in the sense that nobody cannot presuppose them in what they say and think, even if they overtly deny them. Now, history is no exception to this pattern. History is invented by the ancient Greeks, and I think that Herodotus is the first historian. Now, the Greeks think that history is distinct from two other things which have gone before. Number one, mythology, and number two, epic poetry. Now, by mythology, they mean stories about individuals, heroes, who are probably fictional. Heracles, Jason and the Argonauts, Theseus and the Minotaur, this sort of thing. These individuals are probably fictional. Or if we say, through some sort of Gareth Evans theory of reference, that no, there's a chain that leads back to an individual who is the Heraclitus or the Heracles or the Jason, then the historical individual almost certainly bears very, very little resemblance to the mythological individual. So myth is essentially fiction, or essentially perhaps metaphor, but myth has a colossally important function. A society, in a way, defines itself in terms of its myth. And even in history written today, or written over the last few hundred years, it's sometimes terribly difficult to extricate fact from fiction, or historical writing from myth. I mean, what I mean is that if one reads books by British authors about Winston Churchill, or books by American authors about the American Revolution, it's hard to see that these people have wholly escaped a certain perspective, a sort of favoritism. Now, epic poetry is something different from myth. What the Greeks have in mind here, what, for example, Herodotus has in mind here, is, for example, the two great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, authored by Homer. Now, we don't know much about Homer, except that he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey and lived round about 850 BC to 800 BC. It's actually a matter of scholarly debate whether Homer wrote those two epics, but I'm inclined to say we know so little about Homer, we might as well just call Homer whoever it is who wrote the two epics, or there might be something quasi-tautological about saying that Homer wrote those two books. Now, Homer, if he existed, probably lived and wrote around about 850 to 800. But the events depicted in the Iliad and the Odyssey are much earlier. The events depicted in the Iliad are those of the Trojan War, the war between certain states on the Greek mainland and islands against the city of Troy in Asia Minor. Now, the Trojan War took place round about 1300 BC. Round about 1300 BC, approximately 500 years before Homer is thought to have written up the Iliad and the Odyssey as long poems. There's a scholarly literature according to which it's almost certain that Homer is relying on various oral traditions passed down over the 500 years. Now, we know from the archaeology of Schliemann and others over the last 100 years or more that there was a Trojan War, that Troy was besieged, that Troy did eventually fall, and so on. But the epic poetry of Homer is bound up with fiction or embellishment or powers of the gods. Now, I'll say something about this, I suppose. There's one idea in mythology, but certainly even more pronounced in Greek epic poetry, which is important. The gods in this early Greek world, are perhaps surprisingly not the most powerful force, or not the ultimate authority on what happens. So to use a spatial metaphor, above the gods is fate. There's fate. Now, the gods themselves are subject to fate, but crucially, it's the role of certain supernatural beings called the Fates. It's the role of supernatural beings called the Fates to ensure that fate happens, to ensure that what is fated will happen. And often it seems to be the role of the gods, for example, Zeus and perhaps Athene, to ensure that what is fated to happen will happen. That particular heroes don't attempt to, Achilles, Hector, and so on, Paris, don't attempt to exercise a measure of free will, which would entail that what is fated to happen does not happen. Now, I'm giving you this picture because the idea of fate will be important to the Greek conception of history. Our word history comes from the Greek word historia, I-S-T-O-R-I-A. It's usually transliterated without an H at the beginning. Historia. Now, this Greek word historia simply means inquiry or investigation. It doesn't carry any special connotation of inquiry into the past. And an istor, I-S-T-O-R, is an inquirer or an investigator or perhaps a consultant over disputes. Now, having said all that, I'll turn to the Greek and Roman historians themselves. If we look at Herodotus first, we don't know exactly when Herodotus lived, but he lived roughly from 490 to 429 BC. And his major work is called the Histories, and it chronicles the Persian War of 490 to 478 BC. Now, I don't want to go into detail about the history, even though it's quite interesting. During this period, well, this war is a war between the Persian Empire and the Greek states. And for the first time in their history, arguably, the Greek states show a measure of unity or combined force in order to defeat the invasions by the Persian Empire. Now, there are two main invasions by the Persian Emperor. The first invasion is in 490 BC, and the Persian Emperor leading this invasion is Darius, or Darius. And the second invasion in 480 BC is led by Xerxes, X-E-R-X-E-S, Darius and Xerxes. Now, Herodotus is concerned to provide us with a narrative of the war and the eventual victory of the Greeks, the eventual defeat of both Persian invasions. But what's noticeable about Herodotus, so I'll make a number of points about Herodotus's method. The first thing to note, if you read the histories, is that much of Herodotus reads like anthropology rather than history. Herodotus himself is extremely widely travelled. We know that Herodotus travelled to Assyria, including Babylon. We know that Herodotus travelled down the coast of what's now Lebanon and Israel and visited at least Tyre and probably other Phoenician cities. We know, or we think we know, that Herodotus spent considerable time in Egypt, but this is a matter of, this is contested by some historians. But a look through the first half of the history shows that Herodotus is cataloguing in these places the local food, medicine, dress, languages, funeral rites, use of animals, religious rituals, use of boats, trade, in the area that is the Persian Empire. Now, what Herodotus is trying to do here is reconstruct the mentality and the lifestyle of different parts of the Persian Empire, which extends over what we would understand as the Middle East and as far as India at this time. Now, that is a recognizably historical project, or there's a question in philosophy of history which is, can we understand a mentality which is not our own? Or can we understand a mentality without sharing it? Or can we understand ways of living that are not our own ways of living? And if we can understand those, can we know when we've achieved it? Can we know when we've got it right? What is the criterion or the test for having understood in this kind of situation? Now, it strikes me that in raising that question, we're actually raising a version of the philosophical problem of other minds. In philosophy, the problem of other minds is the problem, well, it's a cluster of problems, but one way of putting the problem is to ask the question, how do I know that other people think? Or a related question, how do I know what other people think? Or how do I know that there's any consciousness except my own? Or how do I know that solipsism is false? Now, there are two ways of taking this cluster of questions. On one way of taking them, there's a skeptical connotation. The skeptical connotation is, by the way, perhaps only I think, or by the way, perhaps other people don't have minds, or by the way, perhaps solipsism is true. But the other way of taking the cluster of questions is this. It's completely obvious that other people think. It's completely obvious that other people think. Or it's psychologically extremely difficult to doubt that other people have minds. But given that we do know that, how do we know that? Given that we know that, how do we know that? By which route did we come to know that other people think or other people have minds? Now, the problem in the philosophy of history, it seems to me, presupposes the problem of other minds, which is a general problem in philosophy or in epistemology and metaphysics. But the problem of other minds presupposes a much deeper metaphysical problem, and that is, there is a distinction between your mind and every other mind. There's a distinction between your mind and every other mind. Or, to put it another way, there's a me, everybody else distinction. A me, everybody else distinction, where me is, me entails the existence of consciousness. Now, the deep metaphysical problem is we've got no idea why this asymmetry exists. We have no idea why this asymmetry exists between being a person, the one who you are, and the existence, on the other hand, of all those people who you are not. In other words, we don't know why someone is yourself. We know roughly why the human being who you are exists, but we don't really have much idea why that human being is you and why it gives unique and direct access to the inside of consciousness. If we were in a position to solve this problem, we'd probably be in a position to solve the problem of other minds. If we were in a position to solve that, we'd be in a position to address the historical question of whether we can reconstruct other mentalities. Now, okay, so this is we could call this the anthropological version of the problem of other minds. It's a problem that anthropologists face as well as historians. I remember being on an archaeological dig in the Lake District in the early 1980s, I suppose, and somebody had a piece of Samian ware, the quite common on Roman occupation levels, piece of Samian ware. Samian ware pottery, orangey red, pinky pottery, named after the island of Samos, because people thought it came from Samos. They found out it's nothing to do with Samos, but the name stuck. It's known as Samian ware. Now, on the fragment of Samian ware, there was an animal which looked a bit to me like a lion. It might not have been a lion. It wasn't very clear. If you've got something like that, something you see on films, if somebody is handling something like that, they wipe their thumb over it to clean it. One of the first things they tell you on an archaeological dig is never ever do that, because you wipe the lion off if you try to clean the mud off the Samian ware. Okay, now I spoke to somebody and they said, oh well, Samian ware was imported from Gaul, from the Rhone Valley, to the Lake District, or what's the area we now know as the Lake District in the north of England. Well, I wondered, in the Rhone Valley, or in the northwest of England in the 1st century AD, in the AD 70s, do they thereby have the concept of a lion? If so, what's their concept of a lion like? Is this a depiction of a lion, or is it a depiction of some mythical beast, or is it somebody's impression of a lion, or is it an inaccurately drawn lion? Now, this is what I mean when I say that history faces the problem of other minds. It's not only clear how we can answer questions like that, it's not clear when we've succeeded and when we've failed. One of our guesses might be right, for all we know. Now, the second thing about Herodotus is that he's very cynical about the myths. He mentions mythology, but in quite a cynical and sneering kind of way, and tends to deal in naturalistic and humanistic explanations rather than in supernatural explanations. The third thing about Herodotus, however, he says there are the following, according to Herodotus. There's destiny, doom, nemesis, necessity, and inevitability. For example, in the fall of the Persian Empire. Now, this seems to imply that Herodotus has inherited from epic poetry and mythology the idea of fate. Herodotus still thinks that what happens is fated. Now, what happens is fated. What does that mean? Well, this much seems clear. If it's fated that P, then not possibly not P. If it's fated that P, then not possibly not P. Now, we can raise as a philosophical question, is everything inevitable? Is everything inevitable? Now, we should put in brackets or leave on one side a related question. Is everything inevitable given its causes? Given its causes? Question mark. Is everything inevitable given its causes? Put that in brackets and leave that on one side for a moment, because answering yes to that question gives us determinism. The causal thesis, known as determinism, is the thesis that if the cause happens, the effect can't fail to happen. Now, Herodotus is arguing, well, actually people are very short of argument. Herodotus is maintaining a different position from that. He's maintaining that everything is inevitable tout court, or everything is inevitable, come what may. Now, one of the earliest and one of the best philosophical discussions of fate is by Aristotle in De Interpretatione, Book 9, or Concerning Interpretation, Book 9, De Interpretatione, Book 9, or perhaps About Explanation, Book 9. Now, Aristotle says that there is the following prima facie position. The past has only happened in one way. The past has only happened in one way. Of course, historians disagree about what happened in the past and how it happened, and we interpret the past in different ways. But in a sense, the past is one set of events, even though very large in number, arguably infinite in number if we don't have good criteria for counting past events. Aristotle says that the future, like the past, will only happen in one way. The future, like the past, will only happen in one way. We now, in the present, are ignorant of the way in which the future will happen. We're ignorant of the way in which the future will happen, but it will only happen one way. Now, the example Aristotle gives of this is a sea battle, or the sea battle tomorrow. He says either there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or there will be no sea battle tomorrow. He perhaps has in mind the decisive defeat of the Persian navy by the Athenians at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, near the Piraeus, near the harbour of Athens. So either there will be a sea battle tomorrow, or there will be no sea battle tomorrow. It's just that what we call freedom or contingency or indeterminism is only our ignorance, So the future will only happen in one way. It will include the sea battle tomorrow, or it will exclude the sea battle tomorrow. And the future is, so to speak, as fixed as the past. Now, Aristotle says that the premise in this position is that there will be a sea battle tomorrow is either true or false. There will be a sea battle tomorrow is either true or false. And there will be no sea battle tomorrow is also either true or false. Now, all that's true according to Aristotle. But Aristotle says we can't conclude from these points that fatalism is true, because according to Aristotle, all that's true is the whole conjunction. There will be a sea battle, or it's not the case that there will be a sea battle tomorrow. There will be a sea battle, or it's not the case that there will be a sea battle tomorrow. That whole conjunction is true. It's true now. But we can't conclude from that which of the two disjuncts is true. Therefore, we don't have to conclude fatalism according to Aristotle. Now, I'm not saying that Aristotle's considerations are decisive, because there's a metaphysical problem here that is unsolved, or there's something that we don't understand. And the metaphysical problem is, what is the difference between the past and the future? What is the difference between the past and the future? Now, of course, one's inclined to say, well, Stephen, the past, well, that's what's happened, and the future, well, that's what's not happened yet. That's right, but we need to know what the difference is between having happened and not having happened yet. And we need to know what the demarcation is, what the line is, what the present is that divides the past from the future. Now, I suggest that you personally, you in this room now, you personally, the individual who you are, divide the past from the future. It's your own existence that divides the past from the future, because the past is everything that's happened earlier than you in this room listening to this now. And the future is everything that will happen later than you listening to these words now. So you are the dividing line between the past and the future. Now, that's obviously extremely odd, because we can raise the question, well, why should you personally have such immense cosmic significance? Why should your own personal existence split reality into two mutually exclusive portions? Everything that has happened up to you now, and everything that will happen after you now. Now, there are really two ways of looking at this. You can say, well, this is really not so momentous after all, because Frederick the Great could have put his violin down on a stool on some day in 1740, and Frederick the Great might have said, well, everything that's happened up to me, Frederick the Great, putting this violin down, is the past. Everything later than this event is the future. And he would not be wrong. In other words, anybody or any conscious being, by existing, splits reality into past and future. So that means that the past is somebody or other's past, or the future is somebody or other's future. That's to think of oneself as perhaps less important cosmically. But the trouble with that is that it really does seem to be now. It really does seem to be now. It seems as though you or I or we really are splitting the past from the future by our existence. Now, if we could solve this metaphysical problem, i.e. answer the question, what is the difference between the past and the future, then we might be better equipped to solve the problem of fatalism, to say whether the future is open and the past is closed, or the future is contingent and the past is fixed, or something like that. But I'll just say that this metaphysical problem about your own existence has something in common with the earlier question that arose out of history about other minds. That too depended on the peculiarity of something being you, or the oddness of some existence being your own existence. So two metaphysical problems that are prima facie unrelated, are arguably rooted in the odd fact that something is you. I'll have to bash on from Herodotus, I think. I've got quite a few quotations from Herodotus. So I'll move on to Thucydides. Now, there are certain... Thucydides, we think, lived from 460 to 395 BC. We don't really know. But we think that he lived about 65 years, from about 460 to 395 BC. Now, Thucydides writes the history of the Peloponnesian War, the war between Sparta and Athens in the last third of the 5th century. This war ends catastrophically for Athens. It ends in the destruction of the Athenian Empire. Now, Thucydides had various influences which, in a way, equip him to be a historian. Thucydides was either educated by those philosophers called sophists, or had extensive early social contact with the sophists. Now, of course, if you've read Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, you'll know that salient amongst the sophists was Protagoras. And Protagoras is usually understood as an epistemological relativist. In other words, Protagorean philosophers think that, well, there are two versions. Number one, there is no access to truth beyond belief or perception. In other words, we can't know the truth for certain. And secondly, this is another version of their view, I suppose, there is no truth independently of belief and perception. Now, when I interpret the Protagoreans this way, I have in mind the passage in the Theaetetus where Socrates reports Protagoras as saying that everything is for you the way it appears to you. Everything is to me the way it appears to me. A person, anthropos, is the measure of all things. Of the things that are, that they are. Of the things that are not, that they are not. Anthropos, humanity or a human being, anthropos is the measure of all things. Now, to put it bluntly, Protagoras thinks that nobody has ever come across anything except their own perspective or their own point of view, what is disclosed within their own perspective or their own point of view. So no matter what one's worldview or picture of the world or conceptual scheme, it's rooted in the subjectivity of one's own perception. And in particular, no one has access to any meta position or absolute position or bird's eye view or vantage point from which they could arbitrate between these positions. Now, although Protagoras' view is in a way fascinating and I think terribly difficult to refute, it's obvious that Thucydides reacts very strongly against his Protagorean influence, because Thucydides is interested in describing historical facts. He's very concerned to describe the facts as they occur, and not just as they're perceived to be or thought to be or believed to be. Now, in a way, we have a test of Thucydides doing this. Book 8 of his book, The Peloponnesian War, is incomplete, or is only a first draft. And Book 8 contains contradictory accounts by different witnesses various letters, reports of written orders, eyewitness accounts, and so on, in a fairly undigested or non-integrated way. In other words, Book 8 is written as though Protagoras was right. But Book 8 is the only book that we have like this, and it's clearly unfinished. In the other books of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides has made an effort to arbitrate between competing points of view and to delete his sources, not through plagiarism or something like that, but because he thinks that they're no use anymore. They're rungs on the ladder once he's arrived at the truth, or once he's arrived at the facts of what happened in the war. I should say that there are other features of Thucydides which lend him a measure of objectivity or detachment. He was himself trained as a general in the Athenian army. Well, he actually fought for Thrace, the Thracians were allied to the Athenians during much of this period. And Thucydides was a strategos, a general, or a strategist, or a key decision maker, a decision-making army officer near the top of the Greek hierarchy. Now we know that we know that in the war things went quite badly for Thucydides. I wouldn't say that as a general he made a mess of his command, but his forces were defeated, and as a penalty he was banished. But and so he moved to Sicily, and fortunately he owned property in Thrace as well as in Athens, and was able to live in Thrace. But the thing is, I think that the military training and the banishment lend Thucydides' writing a measure of detachment, which it wouldn't otherwise have had. Now, in Thucydides, there's no myth. Myth has gone completely. So I don't know how many points we're on now, 3 or 4. The next point, in Thucydides, there's no destiny, no inevitability, no fate. Now this means that Thucydides thinks that history is made by human choices. History is made by human choices. Now, of course, he doesn't mean that there's no coercion, there's no threat, there's no decision-making in the light of natural and human pressure. In fact, he regards these as essential to decision-making. Now, why would he think that? Well, if we can ask the philosophical question: is there free will? Is there free will? Now, what does it mean to say that somebody does something freely? It means, firstly, they do it. They do it. It means, secondly, they could have not done it. They could have not done it, or they could have refrained from doing it. I think this is, in a way, essential to freedom, the possibility of refraining, or the power of not doing. Now, I think it might be that those two conditions are sufficient for freedom. If somebody does something, and secondly, they could have not done it, it might follow as a matter of logic that they act freely, or what they do freely. But if we say that these two criteria together are sufficient for freedom, we're putting enormous weight on doing. We're putting enormous weight on doing. Or we're drawing a very sharp distinction between these two things. Number one, what is done, and number two, what happens, or what just happens. What is done and what just happens. So on this view, for example, earthquakes and volcanoes just happen. They're caused to happen, but they're not done. We're leaving the mythology aside now. Okay, they're happenings, but they're not doings. But human actions aren't just happenings; they're doings. They're done. I mean, it's not easy to say what the difference is between doing something and something just happening. If I wave my arm like this, if I raise my arm like this, I'm inclined to say that this is something that I do, not something that just happens. But you could imagine the same sort of event just happening. I could say, well, this is really quite extraordinary, but there's nothing I can do about this. Well, look at how extremely odd. It's just like the weather, or a dinosaur rolling over and crushing some trees or something. This has never happened before. It's going out of the room now. Oh, it's leaving. It's leaving. There's nothing I can do about it. It's going. You can imagine that if there was no free will, and what were one's actions became assimilated to happenings in the natural world, it might be a bit like that. So it looks as though there's something that distinguishes happenings from doings. There's something extra that doings have that mere happenings lack. Intention, motive, the possibility of not doing it. Contingency is not, I mean, free will entails contingency, but contingency is not enough to give you free will. Something happens contingently if it happens, but it could have not happened. It happens, but it could have not happened. Although it happens, it might not have happened. Now, it might be that everything's contingent. It might be that although there are earthquakes and tsunamis and terrible things like that, and they really do happen and they're awful, it could be that they are contingent events. If the earth had been different, if the weather had been different, they might not have happened. But you need contingency for freedom, but contingency is not enough for freedom, because we wouldn't say that these tsunamis are done in the way in which raising one's arm is done. So now the next point is that Thucydides tries to give us a causal analysis of the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. It's a very famous passage in ancient history. Now, which tells us something about historical explanation. Thucydides divides the causes of the Peloponnesian War into two categories. First of all, I'll tell you what the causes are first. In the first category, he says the cause of the war was the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta. The growth in the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta. That's a cause of the war. Now, Thucydides says this made war inevitable. This made war inevitable. So, if there's this growth in the power of Athens and this alarm or fear in Sparta, then the war is inevitable. What does inevitable mean here? Well, some event E is inevitable if E cannot not happen, if it can't not happen. So the form of what Thucydides is saying here is if C, then E, or if C, then not possibly not E. If C, then not possibly not E. If the cause happens, then the effect can't possibly not happen. Okay? This is what he means by inevitable. But the second kind of cause, the particular cause, is what's gone down in history because of Thucydides as the Corcyra incident. Corcyra, Corcyra, Corcyra incident. Corcyra is the ancient Greek word for Corfu. Now, it's quite an involved incident that we don't have to really know about. It involves Corinth, Sparta, and Athens, and it involves the breaking of a peace treaty, and it involves fighting mainly with ships and the violation of a peace treaty. But the point about the Corfu incident, or the Corcyra incident, is that it is a trigger, and according to Thucydides, the Corcyra incident determines when the war will break out, not whether the war will break out. The war is already inevitable because of cause one. We're just waiting for the timing, and that's provided by the Corcyra incident. Now, we can distinguish between three kinds of causation here. Number one, a necessary condition. Number two, a sufficient condition. And number three, a trigger. Let's look at necessary condition, just briefly. The intuitive idea of a necessary condition is this. It means that without which not. That without which not. Now, it's not clear that we can understand causation in terms of necessary conditions. It looks as though we can, because supposing priest throws a half brick through this window, and the bursar or somebody comes down and wants to know why the window broke. Well, someone might say, well, a necessary condition of the window breaking is that priest threw a half brick through it. Now that means if priest had not thrown the brick, the window would not have broken. If priest had not thrown the brick, the window would not have broken. The intuitive idea of a necessary condition here is prerequisite, or that without which not, or the cause has to happen in order for the effect to happen, or the effect doesn't happen unless the cause happens. But we might doubt this, we might doubt this, we might doubt this. Is it right that the window would not have broken if priest hadn't thrown a half brick at it? Maybe if priest hadn't thrown a half brick at it, perhaps someone else would have thrown a bottle of wine at it, right? And then it would have broken anyway. We can't be sure that priest throwing the half brick is a necessary condition for the window breaking. But now we could go on debating that. We could say, well, surely it was a necessary condition for that particular breaking of the window. That particular breaking of the window. That there would not have been that particular breaking of the window exactly like that, exactly then, without him throwing the brick. Anyway, that's the intuitive idea of a necessary condition. A necessary condition for an event is something that has to obtain in order for the event to happen. Notice that the class of necessary conditions for any given event is likely to be extremely large. I mean, suppose they probably wouldn't do this, but supposing somebody called the police and said, supposing the police arrived, and the policeman then asked, well, priest, what happened here? Why is the window broken? It wouldn't be wrong to say, well, the class of necessary conditions for a given event is very large. The convention of having windows, for example, is necessary, and we've had that roughly since Elizabethan times, or maybe the reign of Henry VIII. Or another necessary condition for the window breaking is that there's a universe. If there'd been no universe, there'd be no broken window. Or another necessary condition for the window breaking is that there is something rather than nothing. If there'd been nothing whatsoever, there'd have been no window breaking. So we've got to put some sort of limit on the necessary conditions. A sufficient condition as opposed to a necessary condition, in the way we've described that. Sufficient conditions necessitate their effects. Sufficient condition means if C, then E, or always and everywhere, if C, then E, or if C, then possibly not E. Now, I mention this analysis of causation. It's not spelled out by Thucydides, but it's implicit in his sophisticated causal account of the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. And we've moved, as far as explanation is concerned, an awful long way from the myths and the epic poems. Okay.